Good morning. The Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Subcommittee on Primary Health and Retirement Security will come to order. Thank you for joining us today for the Primary Health and Retirement Subcommittee hearing, Superbugs, the impact of antimicrobial resistance on modern medicine. Thank you especially to Ranking Member Marshall, to you and your staff's shared commitment to preparing for and preventing the antimicrobial resistance crisis in the United States. This is the type of partnership that drives results ultimately in Congress. More than 100 years ago, the discovery of antibiotics revolutionized modern medicine. Some experts consider penicillin to be the single most important drug ever created. Antibiotics alone have extended our average lifespan by 23 years. But the rise in antimicrobial resistance threatens to undo 100 years of medical progress. Minor infections could become incurable, leaving patients with chronic illnesses like cystic fibrosis most at risk. Routine surgeries could turn into deadly procedures. A paper cut could become lethal. But with the benefit of a century of scientific advancement on our side, this does not have to be our fate. Our scientists and medical leaders already know what needs to be done. They know that the only medicine better than an antibiotic is prevention. They know that we must use antibiotics responsibly. They know that keeping people healthy and out of the hospital is critical to reducing antimicrobial resistance, yet more than 100 million Americans lack access to primary care. But we here in Congress can do something about that. We can invest in our community health centers and public health infrastructure. We can build world-class health system that reaches every person in every community from Kansas to Massachusetts, and invest in our workforce, empowering a legion of medical professionals to prevent infections from turning into pandemics. And we can keep our people healthy by keeping our planet healthy. Last week, we saw the 4 hottest days on planet Earth ever recorded. A warmer planet will turn our coastlines and waterways into petri dishes. Diseases will spread faster, and new strains will spread farther. Our climate crisis feeds the antimicrobial resistance crisis, and the only answer is to act now. We need a whole-of-government approach to prevent the next public health emergency. And as we saw with COVID-19 pandemic, when crisis strikes, it doesn't strike in a vacuum. An antimicrobial resistance crisis will disproportionately threaten the people who interact the most with the medical system. It will threaten our health care workers, our friends and family who have disabilities, who are pregnant, or who are elderly. It will worsen an opioid epidemic and strike in every community, whether or not they have the resources to respond. It will bankrupt our working class and strain a system already plagued by inequality. But with the wisdom of hindsight, we can improve our pandemic preparedness. We can build a resilient healthcare system designed with people at the very center, designed to take care of all Americans. We can deliver the ingenuity of American innovation, but it will only save us from crisis if the treatment is accessible for everyone. Just as a vision without funding is an hallucination, innovation without access is a fantasy. We can and must create a different future, one that does not repeat the sins of the past. The witnesses here today, doctors on the front lines, patients living with the risk of antimicrobial resistance, companies developing new medications, and researchers connecting the health of our people and our environment will light our path forward. They are fighting for a better future, and Congress must listen and respond. It is time that we guarantee a prepared and equitable whole-of-government plan to prevent a crisis. With that, I will now turn to Ranking Member, Senator Marshall, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for agreeing to hold this hearing on antimicrobial resistance. I got to tell you, I could barely sleep last night. I was so excited to get here. This is why we came to Congress, was to fix problems like this. And I'll tell you why this is near and dear to my heart. certainly since a second-year medical student, tried to understand bacteria and yeast infections and fungus. But the story that I remember is showing up from my OBGYN residency program. We were delivering 15 to 20 babies a day, working 36-hour shifts. But the story that haunted everybody was a young lady that had a C-section and had died maybe 3 months before I got there. And she died from a resistant bacteria, from sepsis, a complication from a C-section. And very few days or weeks went by where they didn't talk about that case. I was there a month or two, and we were having a very high infection rate, higher than I was comfortable with post-operative patients. So I started culturing patients, and that's something you typically don't do when you have a multi-bacteria, gram-positive, gram-negatives, and anaerobes causing these types of infections. But I cultured several people, and they had a methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. I had never even seen a patient with it. I'd read about it. And then I started to go, why are all these patients having a methicillin-resistant Staph aureus? Well, I looked into further, and they were using Primaxin, called Gorillacillin, as a prophylactic, and were treating common urinary tract infections. They were treating everything with it. And obviously this new, I suppose it was a third or fourth generation cephalosporin, was inducing drug resistance. So here we are today. And why is this important? 3 million Americans this year will get some type of an antimicrobial resistant superbug this year. 100 Americans will die today, 100 will die tomorrow, and every day this year from some type of a resistant bug. And I see the need for this rising as diabetes and obesity overwhelm our society. Those are setups for more resistant organisms. And again, in my field of obstetrics, our C-section rates are going up for the same reasons, and we're going to have more infections and more resistant bugs. And then, of course, sexually transmitted diseases. For years, we've had penicillin-resistant gonorrhea, but now it's resistant to Rocephin. Zithromax is not working as well. So it's certainly something I saw every day in my practice. It's interesting, as I did some research on this, the CDC and the World Health Organization both agree that human overuse is the main cause of this increased antimicrobial infections, and I'm sure Dr. Apley will talk about this. But one of the first things I did when I was running for office, I visited most every dairy, most every feedlot in the state, and I was so impressed that there was a veterinarian, if not on staff, literally consulting on a weekly basis, focused on nutrition and cutting back the antibiotic use. And I'm so impressed with how fewer antibiotics those industries are using today compared to 2017 when we passed legislation. I bet Dr. Apley will talk a little bit about that as well. So I'm proud of what we've done in agriculture, but we need to look in the mirror. We, meaning physicians, nurse practitioners, and PAs, need to look in the mirror. Half of the antibiotics that we prescribe are probably not indicated. Now, I wish I could tell you which half it is, but certainly my profession needs to look in the mirror. We need to do more cultures and pay more attention to this as well. Here's the challenge before us. I talked about those 100 people dying every day from some type of resistant organism. That's probably caused by 20 or 30 different bacteria. It's not that you're going to develop one antibiotic that's going to take care of all of these. You develop an antibiotic, and maybe it's specific to an infection from a kidney infection, and another antibiotic would be specific for a pneumonia, and another antibiotic for a pelvic infection. So that's why it's so costly. That's why it's so costly to develop these, realizing that we need 20 or 30 new antibiotics to take on these key infections, as opposed to, say, a diabetic drug that's going to be able to give that to tens of millions of patients, or even Alzheimer's drug. It's developed, it'll probably be given to 1 million patients. When we develop these types of antibiotics, we're hopefully only going to use them each a handful of times, and it just makes the economics of it next to impossible. We have many professional friends and colleagues have asked me to have this patient-centered hearing, so I'm so proud of the all-star group of witnesses we have. I know it's going to be a great hearing. And again, I want to emphasize thank you to your staff as well, Chairman, and the committee staff working together to bring this to light. This is an issue that this committee can literally make a difference today. People ask me why I left practice of medicine to come here, and I would tell them, look, in medicine, I could impact 30, 40, 50 people a day. Here, you and I can impact the lives of thousands of people, certainly 100 people a day that I mentioned dying from an antimicrobial resistant bacteria. So proud to be here and look forward to hearing from our witnesses. Thank you.
And I would ask Senator Marshall for you to introduce our first witness, if you would.
His last 6 years in Congress. Dr. Apley, of course, is a veterinarian with a PhD in pharmacology at the College of Veterinary Medicine at the Kansas State University, home of the Fighting Wildcats. He teaches multiple courses related to food animal medicine, clinical pharmacology, antimicrobial resistance. His research interests include infectious disease, antibiotic efficacy, resistance, antibiotic stewardship, which is certainly an issue here today, drug residues, that'll be interesting, and applications of drugs in food animals. Dr. Apley is a nationally recognized for his work and is among the most influential veterinarians in cattle industry. He recognizes the value of his work. Dr. Apley was appointed a voting member of the Presidential Advisory Council on Combating Antibiotic-Resistant Bacteria. He recently completed 2 terms on the council, serving as vice chair. He currently serves as a diplomat of the American College of Veterinary and Clinical Pharmacology and is a member of the American Veterinary Medical Association. Dr. Apley, thank you so much for agreeing to be here and to testify. We look forward to your information. Should I introduce the next one too, or no? Yeah, Dr. Apley, go ahead.
Dr. Apley, whenever you feel comfortable, please begin.
Thank you. Chairman Markey, Ranking Member Marshall, members of the subcommittee, and my esteemed colleagues, good morning. My name is Mike Apley. I'm a veterinarian and clinical pharmacologist at Kansas State University College of Veterinary Medicine. I also serve as an alternate member on the American Veterinary Medical Association Committee on Antimicrobials. Clinical use of antibiotics and research into their optimal use has been my focus since 1987. Today, we are addressing the issue of antibiotic resistance, more specifically the issue of acquired antibiotic resistance, where antibiotics that were previously effective against a bacterial pathogen have lost the ability to have an impact on the outcome of disease caused by that pathogen in humans or animals. We can think of resistance as the worst case scenario of there being no possible treatment for a bacterial disease. Or resistance can mean that our initial antibiotic choice doesn't work and it is later in the disease process when an effective antibiotic is used. This delayed effective intervention can result in a more prolonged disease course, an increased chance of debilitation, or an eventual failure of antibiotic therapy. Resistance to our initial antibiotic choice can also mean that the remaining options have undesirable side effects which complicate recovery. Acquired antibiotic resistance may occur due to a mutation in bacterial DNA, which is passed down through the subsequent generation, but the other more alarming route for acquiring resistance occurs through the horizontal transfer of resistance genes between different bacteria by means of transferable genetic elements, which encode for a resistance mechanism, a method of transfer, and the means to be incorporated into the DNA of the bacteria receiving the genetic elements. These transferable genetic elements may contain the genetic codes of more than one resistance mechanism, with many of these mechanisms encoding resistance to multiple antibiotics. This is termed multiple drug resistance, or MDR. The conditions leading to acquired antibiotic resistance reaching a point where this resistance has an impact on the use of an antibiotic include frequently applied antibiotic selection pressure, a highly mutable population of bacteria with a short generation time. This selection pressure may result in a higher proportion of the pathogen population being resistant, as well as the expansion of an already resistant bacterial population by reducing the numbers of other bacteria competing for the same resources. The latter situation highlights the importance of the health impact of our normal bacterial flora. To be clear, this is a generalized account of the nature of acquired antibiotic resistance. Discussions should be held in relation to specific combinations of antibiotic exposure the bacteria of interest, and the environment in which the antibiotic-bacterial interaction occurs. We have pathogens which have acquired resistance to most, and in some cases all, of our antibiotic options, and we have pathogens which maintain susceptibility to our most basic first-line antibiotic choices. The severity of the antibiotic resistance challenge to our health is illustrated in the characterization of the major resistance threats to human health by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC. More specifically, their 2019 antibiotic resistant threats report identifies 18 bacteria and fungi estimated to be involved in more than 2.8 million antibiotic-resistant infections each year, resulting in 35,000 deaths. When severe and potentially fatal diarrhea caused by Clostridioides difficile related to antibiotic use is considered, this raises the estimates to 3 million infections and 48,000 deaths. The complex relationship of antibiotic resistance to our healthcare system is reflected in a 2022 special report by the CDC on the impact of COVID-19 on antibiotic resistance. The American Veterinary Medical Association has also published a document identifying antibiotic resistance challenges encountered in veterinary species. Consideration of the challenge of antibiotic resistance has led to the National Action Plan for Combating Antibiotic-Resistant Bacteria, or CARB. An important component of CARB is a One Health approach, which recognizes the relationships between the health of humans, animals, plants, and the environment. Consistent with this One Health approach, the Food and Drug Administration Center for Veterinary Medicine is in the last year of the current 5-year action plan for supporting antimicrobial stewardship in veterinary settings with a recent progress report. I would also like to highlight a resource on antibiotic resistance within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The Presidential Advisory Council on Combating Antibiotic-Resistant Bacteria, or PACCARB. The PACCARB produced the first of 11 reports in 2016, with the most recent report in 2023. I suggest this resource is not only a way to hear from experts, but also as a bridge to many additional resources in the field. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here this morning, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Doctor, so much. And now I'm going to introduce Dr. Helen Boucher. Dr. Boucher is the Dean, as well as Professor of Medicine at Tufts University School of Medicine and the Chief Academic Officer of Tufts Medicine Health System in Boston, Massachusetts. She is a practicing infectious disease physician, and not a wildcat, but a jumbo. She also serves as director of the Stuart Levy Center for Integrated Management of Antigens. In 2015, Dr. Boucher was appointed to the Presidential Advisory Council on Combating Antibiotic Resistance Bacteria. Dr. Boucher, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Markey, Ranking Member Marshall, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for holding a hearing on antimicrobial resistance and for inviting me to testify on behalf of the Infectious Diseases Society of America and in my capacity as Dean of the Tufts University School of Medicine. As an ID physician, I see firsthand how AMR and the dearth of new antimicrobials is harming patients. AMR is everyone's crisis and everyone's responsibility. I'll briefly outline key drivers of AMR, why AMR is one of the most significant health crises of our time, and urgently needed solutions. As Dr. Apley pointed out so beautifully, AMR is pathogens' ability to evolve to resist antibiotics, making those drugs ineffective. While resistance occurs in nature, antimicrobial overuse in humans, animals, and the environment speeds resistance. Antimicrobials are unique in that use in one individual can impact efficacy in the rest of the population. Despite some progress, antibiotics continue to be misused. In 2016, about half of hospitalized patients were prescribed antibiotics, and 30 to 50% of those prescriptions were inappropriate. Environmental factors are also accelerating AMR. Climate change, pollution, wildfires, and denser population settings can all facilitate the spread of AMR through waterborne pathogens, infected burns, and increases in respiratory infections. In 2019, an estimated 1.27 million deaths worldwide were directly caused by AMR, and AMR played a part in nearly 5 million deaths. U.S. healthcare costs linked to infections from 6 of the biggest AMR threats total more than $4.6 billion annually, with $1.9 billion of these costs borne by Medicare. Antimicrobials enable modern medicine. Advances like cancer chemotherapy, organ transplants, hip replacements, C-sections, and other complex care carry a risk of infection and are only possible with antibiotic support. AMR puts all these therapies to which Americans are entitled at risk due to our lack of novel antimicrobials. I specialize in caring for patients undergoing organ transplantation. These patients must be on immunosuppressive medicines to prevent rejection. Inability to eradicate or control an infection precludes transplantation, and infection following transplant is a leading cause of death in this population. I have had the sad duty of caring for a person with an infection caused by a resistant bacteria for which we had no effective antibiotic. He was unable to proceed to the transplant he needed and had to go home on hospice, ultimately leaving his 2 young sons fatherless. AMR is also impacting healthy individuals in our communities. I've cared for otherwise healthy women with resistant urinary tract infections that are no longer treatable with oral antibiotics. This has required 2 weeks of intravenous antibiotic therapy, often started in the hospital, and prolonged time away from work and school. The opioid epidemic is also fueling AMR. Individuals who inject drugs are 16 times more likely to experience an invasive MRSA infection. AMR disproportionately affects communities of color and other marginalized populations. AMR is a national security threat, as bioterror agents may be engineered to resist antimicrobials, and military service people are at heightened risk for infected wounds. IDSA appreciates the HELP Committee's leadership on AMR. We thank Ranking Member Marshall and Senator Blumenthal for spearheading an annual letter urging Congress to provide funding to support improved AMR surveillance, prevention, and research. But we must address gaps. The most important thing this subcommittee can do is advance a policy to establish a pull incentive, such as a subscription model, to spur the discovery and development of novel antimicrobials. A subscription model would pay for these antimicrobials based on their value instead of volume to drive private investment in antimicrobial R&D. The President's budget request proposed such a model, and over 200 organizations support this approach. R&D incentives must be paired with resources for stewardship. Stewardship programs optimize on antimicrobial use, improve patient outcomes, and lower healthcare costs. Unfortunately, many healthcare facilities lack the resources necessary for stewardship. The ID workforce that is needed to confront AMR is in crisis. Patients with serious infections do better when they are treated by an ID physician, but nearly 80% of U.S. counties lack an ID physician, and only 56% of ID physician training programs filled their positions in 2023. Financial barriers hinder recruitment, something I personally grapple with as a dean. ID physicians are among the lowest paid specialists. Congress must help ensure the availability of the ID workforce by improving reimbursement, addressing student debt, and providing resources for training and early career development. Thank you so much for your attention to the critical issue of AMR.
Yep, thank you, Doctor, so much. And next, we're going to hear from Ms. Melanie Lawrence. Ms. Lawrence is a Massachusetts resident and healthcare advocate living with cystic fibrosis. Ms. Lawrence serves on committees for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, Boston Children's Hospital, and Cystic Fibrosis Learning Network. She is also a recipient of the Alex Award, the highest award that CF Foundation gives for her volunteer work to help and support people with cystic fibrosis. Whenever you feel comfortable, please begin, Ms. Lawrence.
Thank you so much. Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Markey, Ranking Member Marshall, and distinguished members of the subcommittee for inviting me here to testify. My name is Melanie Lawrence. I am 43 years old, living with cystic fibrosis. While I am here to speak to you about my experience with infection, drug-resistant bugs are not a problem exclusive to people living with CF. This is a human issue, and last I checked, we're all humans. They are a problem that all Americans will face if we don't find a solution to jumpstart innovation in antimicrobial development. CF is a rare genetic disease affecting nearly 40,000 people in the U.S. that causes the body to produce sticky mucus in the lungs, heightening the risk of infection. When I was diagnosed, my parents were told that my life expectancy would be 16 years old. Today, the median life expectancy for people with CF has increased to 56, but there is still no cure. CF is only a part of who I am, though. It does not define me. I am a single mother to a most amazing 12-year-old son. I am a daughter, a sister, a friend, a proud aunt, and I am passionate about making sure that patients like me and others have access to treatments they need to have fulfilling lives, as well as in a healthcare system that is rooted in humanity. Every day I spend hours taking medications, doing physical therapy, exercise, meditation, breath work, all while raising a very active 12-year-old, trying to create as many meaningful memories with him as I can. Despite being proactive, infections due to drug-resistant Pseudomonas, MRSA, or MRSA, impact my health, and I have relied heavily on antibiotics my whole life. Earlier, I could trust that a 2-week antibiotic course of oral antibiotics would do the trick. This meant as the bacteria in my lungs began outsmarting the antibiotics, I also needed IV antibiotics to keep my infections under control. This meant a 2-week stay in a hospital, and I would have to have antibiotics administered through a PICC line threaded up the vein in my arm. By 18, I needed a larger dose of IV antibiotics for up to 5 weeks at a time. Losing hope, I participated in a clinical trial for IV tobramycin, which ended up causing chronic tinnitus, a severe kidney damage, and I was ultimately removed from the study because of it. Over the next 2 decades, antibiotic resistance became a bigger threat to my health, as did the subsequent side effects of more potent antibiotics. My airways became so damaged that I began having hemoptysis, which is bleeding in my lungs. I also began developing blood clots. Because of that, my only option for IV antibiotics became a temporary IV line placed through my jugular vein. It was no longer possible to eradicate the bacteria, so the goal was to keep my head above water. Now in my 40s, the bacteria in my lungs are resistant to nearly every antibiotic, except for tobramycin, which I cannot take because it is so toxic to my already damaged kidneys and hearing. My focus is to manage my symptoms and maintain the best quality of life possible. Without the security of effective antibiotics to help me heal, I find myself living with chronic fear and anxiety about when the bacteria residing in my lungs will act up or when another infection will take me away from truly living. On a deeper level, I am often navigating a humbling loss of control, loss of autonomy, and a deep subconscious fear of death, of leaving my son without his primary caregiver, the person who knows him best and loves him without abandon, his mom. My body is both my biggest ally, keeping me alive and fighting off these infections, whilst also being my biggest threat, trying to kill me from the inside. And yet, living with CF has been a gift, not a curse. It has opened my eyes to the fragility of time and the importance of connection, and that is a gift we should all be so lucky to receive while we are healthy and able to appreciate it rather than when it's too late. My story is not an uncommon experience in the CF community, nor is it unique to people with CF. Bacteria are abundant, and it is inevitable that more Americans will encounter resistant infections. It is not a question of if you can catch them, it is a question of when. Without new antibiotics, the bacteria will win this war. I thank the subcommittee for giving me the opportunity to share my story and ask that you work together to find innovative policy solutions for patients like me and for all Americans, like the PASTEUR Act. Me personally, I would love to see my son graduate college or even to become a grandparent, something that I've never even allowed myself to imagine because it feels so out of reach without new antibiotics. Time is ticking and we need your help. Thank you.
Beautiful, thank you. Senator Marshall, would you introduce the next witness?
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to introduce Ms. Christine Miller, who is testifying on behalf of the Antimicrobials Working Group and the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. Ms. Miller is the CEO of the Melinta Therapeutics, a biopharmaceutical company that specializes in novel, broad-spectrum antibiotics to help patients in hospital and community settings. With a background in chemical engineer, Ms. Miller has spent over 20 years championing life sciences innovations, working for small companies to some of the leading innovators in the world. Ms. Miller will shed light on why the commercial marketplace for antibiotics in the United States is at serious risk of collapsing, something my colleagues tell me over and over again. That it's at risk of collapsing due to ongoing reimbursement challenges and supply chain shortages. Again, my friends back home tell me this every day. I go back home and I talk to my friends still practicing. She's going to share why small companies are now responsible for over 95% of global novel antimicrobial development, and even then face bankruptcy in the coming years. Thank you so much for agreeing to testify and share your story. Ms. Christine Miller.
Thank you, Chairman Markey, Ranking Member Marshall, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Christine Miller. I'm President and CEO of Melinta Therapeutics. And Melinta is a small biotech providing innovative therapies to people impacted by acute and life-threatening illnesses. My story begins in New York with two amazing parents who immigrated here from Jamaica. The women in my family dedicated their careers to helping patients. My mother, a registered dietitian, worked at Montefiore Hospital. And as a child, I remember visiting her at the hospital, watching her solve patients' problems. I was inspired to pursue a career in pharmaceuticals when I realized I could use my education, like the women of my family, to help patients. This is why being here today is so important to me. I want to help identify the unmet need of patients and address the issues of availability and access to life-saving antimicrobial medicines. Antimicrobial drugs are the cornerstone of modern medicine. These drugs are critical to effectively deliver medical care for patients receiving chemotherapy, organ transplants, and patients undergoing routine surgical procedures like hip replacement and C-sections. However, bacteria and fungi are living organisms that adapt and evolve over time and become resistant to antimicrobials, a phenomenon known as antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. In the United States, AMR is the third leading cause of death behind heart disease and cancer. Things have gotten worse since the pandemic. In 2020, hospital-acquired drug-resistant infections and deaths jumped 15% as COVID erased years of progress in the fight against superbugs. While drafting my testimony, I was reminded of a story from a patient, Sue Paxton. Sue, who was a recipient of a successful liver transplant, who also found out she had a severe fungal infection when hospitalized. After multiple rounds of antifungals and further deterioration of her condition, Sue and her doctor were able to gain early access to Rezafungin, a novel antifungal developed by Cidara Therapeutics that Melinta will launch later this month. Within days, Sue was on the path to recovery. Unfortunately, what happened to Sue happens all too often in hospitals, and the only way to combat these life-threatening infections is to continually innovate newer, safer antimicrobials and ensure that patients have access to these innovations. It's important to understand that we do not have an innovation problem. The U.S. government recognized the need and has taken action to support research and development needed to address resistant infections. Programs like CARB-X have done an amazing job at reinvigorating the preclinical pipeline. Also, programs through BARDA have been vital to combat AMR. Melinta is a partner in a public-private collaboration with BARDA to advance 2 FDA-approved antibiotics for use in pediatric patients and for use against biothreat pathogens. We also do not have an approval problem. Congress already enacted a policy to streamline regulatory approval for antimicrobials. Companies are getting innovative products approved, but are failing after launch. What we do have is a commercial marketplace problem that is fundamentally unique to antimicrobials, driven by reimbursement and access challenges. As a result, many biotech companies run out of money in the quest to provide patients with access to life-saving therapies. Unless we see changes to the post-approval side of the equation, the ability to bring these products to patients remain in jeopardy. The good news is that Congress and the federal government are in the position to solve this problem. policies to increase access to new antimicrobials through reforms to antimicrobial reimbursement, and novel payment mechanisms called pull incentives that decouple payment from the volume of antimicrobials used are urgently needed now. Without changes to the system, we will continue to see access challenges and further deterioration of the innovation pipeline. And patients, our family members, our neighbors will continue to die. My hope for today is that this committee views all of today's testimony as a call to action to fix the commercial marketplace. AMR remains a silent killer in hospitals every day. Every year we wait to address this crisis is another year more patients are at risk for losing their lives. Thank you for your attention to this public health crisis, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Thanks to this great panel. Now we'll turn to questions from the subcommittee. Ms. Lawrence, as a cystic fibrosis patient, you know more than anyone, CF patients are more prone to infection and must be able to rely on antibiotics that are effective, and that you also have to be able to access and afford this on top of what can be dozens of pills a day for a CF patient. So can you talk about the importance of developing new antibiotics? Ms. Miller just talked about that, and making sure those antibiotics are available and affordable for people like you.
Yes, thank you for the question, Chairman Markey. I think that antibiotics are not the most expensive of all of the drugs that I take. They are probably the most affordable. I am a very avid participant in clinical research to try to bring new drugs and therapies to market. And of all the studies I've done over the decades, I've only done one new antibiotic trial. And even though it did result in lasting permanent side effects, I would do another one in a heartbeat. It's just we don't have the opportunities to find more antibiotics. So it's not so much as a cost issue as it is as an availability and development issue.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Boucher, you're treating patients in Boston every single day. You're seeing how bad the opioid crisis has become. Tufts is right there at the center of it in downtown Boston, and it puts people at risk of antimicrobial resistance. So can you explain to us why people with opioid use disorder are at risk, and how can we mitigate that risk?
Thank you for the question, Chairman Markey. Yes, sadly, we saw data released about a week ago that in Massachusetts, the opioid epidemic is at its worst. And we are seeing increased numbers of patients with MRSA infections, invasive infections. The way these individuals get sick, it starts often with a very simple thing, interruption of the skin. So injection interrupts the protective layer that the skin gives our body. And people are colonized, the skin's colonized with the staph bacteria that gets into their system. What happens in these individuals is that they become sicker. Many of them are also malnourished, have other underlying diseases, hepatitis C, other things. So treating them is complicated. Many of them experience homelessness, so following through on treatment is complicated. They go into environments where they can spread the infection. That propagates the problem, so it gets into more social problems as well as medical problems. In the hospital, these patients require greater care. They need to be isolated in private rooms. We have to protect ourselves so that we don't spread the infection to other patients. It adds greatly to costs, to morbidity and mortality for those patients.
Okay, great, thank you. And there is no silver bullet, Dr. Apley. Could you tell us about the orchestra of different entities that will be needed to work together in order to prevent this crisis from spreading further?
Thank you, Chairman Markey. When I look at that, the combination, it's infection prevention, which is very, very, very important, a huge part of our efforts. Diagnostics, we have challenges with having access to rapid diagnostic tests, and as I understand from my days on PACCARB, we sometimes have challenges getting reimbursed for the tests we do have that we're able to put in. Accurate tests, and then our antimicrobial susceptibility testing interpretation and continuing to develop breakpoints and more rapid tests for pathogen identification and determining which antibiotics might be the best. I think those are really the main components. The other thing is on both human and veterinary sides are very, very focused initiatives on antimicrobial stewardship. And this also gets into the realm of behavior as it relates to antimicrobial prescribing.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Miller, for infectious diseases, like Dr. Boucher, what is stopping them from using the most innovative antibiotics that they have decided would be best for their patients? What role does your company and companies like it have in helping to ensure that there isn't red tape in between the doctor and their patients?
Well, thank you for the question. So companies like ours, like Melinta, we are very much focused on creating access anytime we can for patients. When we are working with hospitals and hospital systems, it definitely is quite complicated to get a new product on formulary. There is a bit of a red tape, but our organization works tirelessly to make sure that hospitals are aware of the latest therapies and provide them all the information that they need in order to get our products onto hospital formularies. However, what we do know is that hospitals are disincentivized from putting newer, innovative products on their formulary and having their use because of the cost. It is definitely more more of an incentive because of the way reimbursement works in the hospital for hospitals to use older, cheaper generic drugs as front line versus using newer, innovative products.
Great, thank you. Senator Marshall.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll yield to Senator Button.
Thank the ranking member. Thank the chair for having this hearing as well. Mrs. Miller, thank you all, and thank the whole panel for being here today. Ms. Miller, your testimony mentions the period between lab research to clinical trial launch as the valley of death, taking anywhere from 10 to 15 years and billions of dollars, as I understand it, before a new antibiotic can come to market. So how can we build on successful public-private partnerships like CarbX to bring more clinical antibiotic candidates to the market?
So as I mentioned before, CarbX has been really great at reinvigorating the pipeline. Unfortunately, some of those products are, far from actually coming to market. But BARDA has other programs, other private-public partnerships that are helping to bring innovation to the marketplace faster than if companies were trying to do that on their own. We just announced a recent partnership with BARDA for a private-public partnership, and what that will allow us to do is bring innovation for pediatric patients to market faster.
Thank you for that. When I go on their website for CarbX, it shows a little over $300 million, a little under $400 million that has been invested.
Yeah.
What attracted those dollars, and how do we make that more if it's a good program?
Well, I think the first thing is focusing on where is there an unmet medical need, right? So we see the trends, we see where infections are higher, where resistance is higher, and so when companies can bring forward ideas to CarbX for funding, there's an opportunity there for collaboration. There's also the need to focus on preparedness, right? So not just the infections that we're battling today, but what could be the infections in the future, the pathogens that we need to be most concerned about from a biothreat perspective. There's opportunities to collaborate there as well.
Thank you. Now, you also mentioned a second valley of death when the FDA approves a new drug, but patients can't access it because hospitals keep physicians from prescribing the newest therapies. Mm-hmm. So can you go into more detail about the perverse incentives that are out there that keep new therapies on the shelf instead of being prescribed to patients? And then what reforms to the GAIN Act should Congress pursue to bring more novel drugs forward and to ensure patients have access to those drugs?
Well, I want to make sure that it's clear that we support antimicrobial stewardship. We believe it's important to use the right drug at the right time for the right bug. And so stewardship is important. And as a result, antibiotics and antifungals are going to be used more sparingly than you would see a typical product, especially in a hospital setting. However, the way reimbursement is set up in the hospital with DRG, hospitals are incentivized to use cheaper or less expensive medication than newer, more potentially costly innovation. And so what we'd like to see is a reform to reimbursement so that hospitals are not incentivized to put our newer antibiotics on the shelf in reserve, but to use them when it's appropriate. They need to do the right testing, of course, but when they see that a bug is susceptible to a newer antibiotic or to a newer antifungal, they shouldn't be prohibited from using that because of cost. At the end of the day, the cost of inaction, of not using the right product sooner, costs the healthcare system money, and of course, it costs lives.
Thank you for that. Again, thank you all. I yield.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you, Chairman Markey and Ranking Member Marshall, for this hearing. I just also want to thank all the witnesses for your participation and testimony. And Ms. Lawrence, I'm especially grateful for your testimony. It's hard to talk about personal experience in a large setting like this, but it's really, really important. So thank you. I want to start with a question to you, Ms. Miller. You've just been having some of this discussion with Senator Budd, but antibiotic resistance is obviously a serious and emerging threat to global health, and we need to work together to encourage the development of new products that can treat infections that resist current antibiotics, and that's obviously the whole point of our discussion today. What I'm understanding is that many large drug companies used to develop antibiotics, but over the last decade, this field has narrowed to a handful of small biotech companies, right? So you've just been talking with Senator Budd about some of the obstacles for investment here, but for these smaller operations that are now driving the research, are there any obstacles you haven't discussed to antibiotic innovation and bringing new antimicrobial drugs to market?
Thank you. The crux of it is the commercial marketplace problem. If there were to be a sound commercial marketplace, then you would see larger companies and investors willing to invest in the space. Because of the broken marketplace, this is why you have only a few companies actually doing development in the space. Fortunately, we do have collaborations with BARDA and other private-public partnerships that are helping and assisting, but it's not enough. We need to fix reimbursement. We need to have pull incentives that will help address the commercial marketplace and make it possible for companies to be sustainable in the space.
Well, thank you for that. One of the things that I think we could do, in addition to pursuing government investments in boosting the demand for new antibiotics, is to look at ways we could leverage the tax code to provide incentives to startups so that they would engage in this kind of innovative research. So I'll continue to pursue that as well. Dr. Boucher, while drug innovation is essential, bringing new antimicrobials to market only addresses part of the problem. And Dr. Apley was just discussing some of that with Senator Markey. Doctors also need tools like testing capabilities and advanced equipment that can mitigate the threat of drug-resistant infections. So outside of new drug development, can you speak to other areas of innovation that are critical to meeting the threat of drug-resistant infections, such as diagnostic tests and more advanced antimicrobial surfaces in hospitals?
Sure. Thank you, Senator Hassan. Absolutely. So this problem is a wicked problem, and it requires a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
So infection prevention is vitally important, and that's everything from washing our hands to making sure every procedure that we do on a patient is done in the best way to prevent as many infections as possible. Yep. Diagnostic testing, which Dr. Apley raised, very important, and we're in a situation where we have the science that has brought us incredible technology for diagnostic testing, but there is this disconnect in both the way they're developed and approved by the Food and Drug Administration and the way they're reimbursed by the government and private payers and in hospitals.
Right.
That's been a barrier. Then I'll come back to the workforce. In my role as the dean, I have the privilege to help educate the workforce of tomorrow. And that's not just physicians, it's all other health professionals. We need experts to do this work. You heard from Dr. Apley a little bit of how complicated it is to actually choose the right drug for the right patient. We need to be able to attract people to do this work so that our children and their children will be protected.
Well, thank you for that. And that takes me to my last question, which is to Dr. Apley. You've written extensively about promoting the responsible use of antibiotics in animals. How do we engage all providers in a broader conversation to promote responsible, medically appropriate use of antibiotics?
Thank you for that question. I'll address from the veterinary side
Yeah.
what we're doing. We work through both producer organizations and veterinary associations. We've developed guidelines for our veterinarians to put stewardship programs in action. And we spend a lot of time starting right at the start with case definitions, diagnostics, and applications, and then reasonable choices. So it's a combination effort between everyone on our side of caring for animals. And we've had one whole meeting at PACCARB that was based on communication. And that communication aspect and aiding in that communication is the basics of all of it.
Well, thank you, and I will yield back and may follow up in terms with all of you about what resources and guidance is useful to practitioners and how we can make sure they have the best information readily available. Thanks.
Thank you. Senator Marshall.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Lawrence, you're a living, breathing miracle. And we want you to know that we want you to see your son graduate from high school. We want to see you have grandchildren someday as well. And I remember my first patient, OB patient, with cystic fibrosis. I mean, there was once upon a time no cystic fibrosis patients would think about conceiving, and it was certainly just an incredibly tough pregnancy if they did. So in many ways, the innovation is working because of these innovative drugs as well. What does your doctor say about your future? What does your future look like?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Marshall. There have been so many medical advances, especially with the highly effective modulators, but they are not a cure, and they do not prevent infection. They have offered a level of stability, which has been really nice.
Is that the gene therapies, the modulators?
Not the highly effective modulators, as in like Trikafta, which I can explain more, but it would take me a long time.
That's okay.
And so it stabilizes the experience. For many patients, it raises pulmonary function tests and decreases infection. I have been in clinical trials for every generation of these modulators, and it has made a big difference, but it is not stopping me from getting infections. That is my biggest threat, and also like the infection breeds pneumonia, breeds hemoptysis, and it's just this vicious cycle. So that is my biggest threat by far. And if I may, Chairman Markey, I just wanted to add to my answer to your question about new antibiotics. There's also a timing factor, and while I have very good access to health care and affordable insurance, in order for them to cover a new antibiotic, they make it extremely hard, and there are hoops that need to be jumped through, and cultures take days to come back, while my infection is rapidly progressing to pneumonia and other.
Is it like a prior authorization issue that your doctors have to go through?
With some of the newer antibiotics, you have to submit a culture, you have to prove that all the antibiotics are resistant, you have to test it to see if you're...
Right.
It's this whole process that requires often inpatient hospital stays. So they definitely do not make it easy to access the newer antibiotics.
Thank you. Dr. Boucher, I'm going to get a free medical consult from you here. Most of your patients you see are probably people that survive organ transplants, that they've taken cancer therapy recently, and then we lose them to an infection. What would the message of hope you give to a cystic fibrosis patient like Miss Lawrence? What do you need to be successful so she can see her grandchild?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a huge privilege to take care of patients before and after transplants and after life-saving chemotherapy and with cystic fibrosis. What we physicians and all clinicians need is we need tools in our toolbox, right? We need ways to prevent infection, and we need drugs to treat those infections which still happen. Yeah. So, and it's not just one, as was pointed out earlier. We need a pipeline that is robust and renewable because we know resistance will march on. And so really finding a solution to that, that's the idea of this subscription model, is a way to focus on value, not volume of antibiotics, to use them well through stewardship, but to have them be developed and delivered to our patients in ways that are predictable and reproducible, so that those drugs that the government invests in will be on the shelf in my pharmacy when a patient has a life-threatening infection, not requiring a week-long prior approval, but on the shelf in the pharmacy in Boston for the patient.
Got it. Dr. Boucher, not many people have watched somebody die. What's it like to watch your patients die because you don't have the right antibiotic? You know, it starts off as a kidney infection. It starts off with a pneumonia. What's it like to watch them die and not have the antibiotic that you need?
Well, I'll just start by saying I chose the profession of infectious diseases 30 years ago to cure patients, right? Antibiotics, as Senator Markey said at the open, are curative, life-saving drugs. So I came into this field to cure people of infections and send them home to live their lives, to enjoy the transplant, that precious gift that they get. So coming to the point where I've had the sad duty to sit with a lady who lived through rounds of chemotherapy for her leukemia, who had an infection for which we had no therapy, and to watch her go from sitting in the chair to sicker and dead in a number of days is beyond heartbreaking. It's a privilege to care for patients at that time in their life, but it's absolutely heartbreaking and not the reason that I went into medicine or so many others go into medicine.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Apley, speak a little bit about what agriculture, protein production, what we've done to decrease the use of antibiotics and to address these issues, and specifically talk a little bit about how the 2017 law has impacted your world.
Thank you, Senator Marshall. If you go back to 2017 and look at the FDA sales data for antibiotics following that, and 2017 was the start of the transition to all medically important antibiotics used in feed to the Veterinary Feed Directive, and any used in water to under veterinary control. And the next year we saw, for example, tetracycline use drop by around a third as the veterinarians took control of that and had discussions with their clients based on the stewardship principles. You know, the last time a new antibiotic group was approved that we use in food animals was 1978, that a new group was approved. So we are using tried and true older compound groups. We get new members of them. Also, if you look at our veterinary organizations, we ascribe to the AVMA stewardship definition and the ways we go through to look at those. The other thing that just happened July 1 of 2023 was that all of our antimicrobials now that were previously over the counter have gone under veterinary control. So veterinarians are involved in all decisions. And we have some very frank and candid discussions about what we should and shouldn't be doing and how we address issues of prevention control, animal movement, et cetera, biosecurity to decrease the need.
That's great. And by the way, we have some agriculture initiatives with food supplements, feed supplements that would also decrease a lot of those bacteria as well. Ms. Miller, I'm going to finish up with you several questions here as well. Big picture, how many failures does your company have before they get one across the finish line?
Well, I mean, in this space, you probably have a 1% chance of getting a product from initial idea conception to approval. It's a pretty high failure rate when it comes to development, and a pretty costly one.
Yeah. When I used to help run a hospital, and you try to keep your formulary tight from a cost management standpoint. And some of the antibiotics that you would make maybe only be used 5, 10, 20 times a year as well. And there's no way that my hospital could afford to keep that in stock. And we think about the DRG reimbursement. So if a patient is admitted for pneumonia, we're going to get a lump sum of money, whether we use ampicillin or a cephalosporin or maybe your miracle drug as well. So a basic DRG, and I know there's exceptions to that. Can you just kind of walk us through what your solution would look like for that type of patient that probably is going to be resistant? You know, they've got COPD and they've been in the ICU for 3 days already. They're not getting better. You know it's drug-resistant antibiotic. What would the solution look like from a reimbursement model?
Well, I think it's important to look at the big picture. So yes, there's a DRG, and I do believe that we need to reform reimbursement. We can look at using NTAP as an example. That's already a framework in place, and we can make reforms to it so that antimicrobials are better suited for use in the NTAP construct. However, we have to look at what does it cost to have that patient hospitalized for extended period of time. I can tell you that every day a patient is in a hospital, not getting the care that they need, further deteriorating, costs the hospital and costs healthcare much more than
Probably
it would
$5,000 or
be.
$10,000 a day, literally.
Exactly. And so we have to really consider that the products that we have developed, that we have made available, or we're making available to patients, are curative. Right? This is invaluable.
Right. So I appreciate the answer and be respectful. I need to move on. I do appreciate everybody coming to your testimonies today. I need to go to another hearing. I'd like to come back and circle back about how do hospitals share that particular drug. Not all small hospitals could keep every one of those in stock, but how do we better share those as well, and so that Tufts can get it tomorrow, but also Great Bend Regional Hospital can get it tomorrow as well. So thank you so much, Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Marshall, and again, thank you for your partnership on this issue. Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank all of you for your time. I was trying to come up the stairs, so I still barely have caught my breath coming up the 4 floors here. Obviously, microbiologically weakened somehow. A more serious note, I learned firsthand the importance of what we're talking about today. My father passed away in 1960 after a long battle with colorectal cancer. But a big part of his challenge was the fact that they pretty much only had penicillin in those days. And after a couple of years, several operations, he would get infections that they were unable to treat. And my mother would tell stories about waking up in the middle of the night several times and he would have had cold sweats, and she'd have to roll him over and get a clean sheet under him, then roll him back on the clean sheet, get the rest of the sheet put down. And what a trial that was for him every night. And it's amazing that we've come so far, and yet we still haven't progressed as far further as one would hope in this issue. So I'll start with Dr. Boucher. The development of new antimicrobial drugs hasn't kept pace with the increasing rate with these pathogens become drug resistant. Obviously, in a large part due to the fact that there's not much financial incentive, as we're hearing discussed today, to innovate in this drug space. We've co-sponsored the Pasteur Act, which you referred to, which would allow the federal government to enter into subscription contracts with critical need antimicrobials. Dr. Boucher, how would the subscription mechanism embedded in the Pasteur Act incentivize the development of new antimicrobials?
Thank you very much for your question, Senator, and for your support of the Pasteur Act. The Pasteur Act uniquely values antibiotics for their value, not for their use. So it delinks any incentive to overuse antibiotics, and it focuses on the most needed antibiotics for the most resistant infections. There are clear criteria that a developer needs to meet to get this benefit of this subscription reimbursement, guaranteed reimbursement, and it's linked to stewardship, which is very, very important to ensure that we clinicians use the antibiotics in the best way possible so that they're preserved for as long as possible. And this is felt to be a much needed first step in getting us back to a healthy economic framework for antibiotics. And I just wanted to come back to the comment about CARB-X that was made earlier. CARB-X is probably the most successful public-private partnership with BARDA and many other agencies. To date, CARB-X has over a dozen products in clinical trials, that's in patients. And if we don't see progress in something like the PASTEUR Act, all that investment will go to waste and those medicines won't get to our patients. So really, really important, and thank you so much for your support.
No, of course, and thank you for all your work. Ms. Miller, a lot of the drug research and development is obviously, it's been discussed by all of you, hard work and doesn't often without many victories. Many of the skilled professionals behind this research, you know, the creators of these innovations are often lured away from the uncertain antimicrobial drug market for more commercially viable pursuits. The PASTEUR Act is designed specifically to help reduce some of that uncertainty and to improve the viability of the market. So in your opinion, how would the stability of the PASTEUR Act help support recruitment and retention, not just recruitment, but retention of the workforce we need to develop these drugs?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. Absolutely, there has been a brain drain, we call it, in the ID space. You have talent within the industry who, you know, really have concerns about how much there has been a underinvestment in antimicrobials. And so people have left and gone to other pursuits like oncology and other chronic diseases where the marketplace is more certain. What PASTEUR does and you know, novel pull incentives, it creates the possibility of stability in the marketplace. And so that, knowing that there would be a sustainable marketplace would then help bring people back into the space, not just people from a development point of view, but investors as well.
Right. And I see I'm out of time already. That's impossible. But anyway, I'll try to get back. If I don't, I'll make sure that my additional questions get entered into, you all get a chance to see them and respond in writing. Thank you all again for your great public service.
Yep. Thank you, Senator. Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an interesting discussion because it looks like we're up against a foe that so easily outmaneuvers us. The more you use something that's effective temporarily, the more you're giving it the chance to change and require something different. I got interested in this, and it's, I think, called a spirochete instead of a bacterium, but it's with something that we didn't know much about at all, tick-borne diseases. And then you find out that it's an old drug called doxycycline that's the only thing that can knock them out. And I guess what I'm wondering is, are we in a never-ending battle of where we can never get ahead of this? When you're saying only 1% of any investment in something to, you know, waylay any new malady hits pay dirt, where does this dynamic end? Because it looks like the dynamic generally favors the microorganism. So my question would be, we'll start with Dr. Boucher, what is the most recent example where there's been something so bad, so widespread, where a current antibiotic wasn't working? How long did it take to marshal the resources when you knew that you needed to actually get something to the marketplace that was going to work?
Thank you for your question, Senator Braun. I think we have to look at the example of COVID, right? It's a virus, not a bacteria, but we marshaled, right, and got a vaccine into arms in less than a year, right, and drugs into patients very quickly, remdesivir, et cetera. We can do this, right? The science exists. There are numbers of candidate drugs, vaccines, diagnostics that have advanced scientifically. There's no dearth of science. The issue is really this economic problem, and solving that at the same time as we enact the multi-pronged approach of prevention, surveillance, good diagnostic tests, all the other things that are required to combat this wicked problem. But we live in a country where technology is advanced. We transplant every day. A heart transplant is normal business, in a hospital today.
We did that in the matter of, because a lot of that research was kind of building towards it, and then it finally got applied. What would you say if that urgency is there? Because sooner or later, it'll be either another virus or a bacterium or even like a spirochete currently, where we have so many more diseases that are out there, tick-borne, that we didn't know about. Thank goodness, doxycycline, very inexpensive, still works. So what would you say when it comes to an antibiotic, not an antiviral, unless they're completely analogous in terms of how you'd get there? Was there anything recently when it's come to something that had to have an antibiotic, and how long did it take?
Yeah, I guess I would say if we look at the most recent antibiotic approval, sulbactam, durlobactam, that was approved for Acinetobacter infections, that's less than 10 years. And that's an infection that we know is coming. It's multi-drug resistant. So this is a game where there needs to be planning in advance for the threats we know and some we don't know. Someone mentioned Candida infections earlier. Candida auris was not on the CDC threat list in 2015. It is in 2019.
And is it one of the biggest concerns right now? And that's
It's a big concern.
Yeah.
So we need infrastructure, and we need something like the Pasteur Act. I think that's the one thing that you all can do, is to advance that bipartisan
So
act.
that we're not doing it ad hoc based upon the very urgent need. Someday that may not be quick enough.
Correct.
Ms. Miller, would you want to weigh in?
So definitely there is a cost in action, and we do need to be planful. We do need to prepare. There is great science out there. It's just waiting to have a stable home to land in. And so if there is one thing that I would ask that be done today, is we need to reform the commercial marketplace. We need reforms to reimbursement. We need pull incentives. We need to fix the commercial marketplace.
Anybody else want to weigh in quickly?
I'll just add one thing, that the PACCARB released a report in March linking pandemic preparedness to AMR, right? This is not if, it's when. And this report goes through all the different aspects that need to be addressed, including the Pasteur Act.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for this hearing. I don't know if everyone in this room knows this, but today is Senator Markey's birthday, I believe. I could not miss this opportunity to embarrass you in front of the whole committee staff.
You've been very successful.
It's always dangerous to go against your committee, your subcommittee chair, your committee chair like this, but happy
you.
birthday, Ed.
Thank you.
I really appreciate all of you, and I appreciate very much this hearing. And I'm getting clearly this, the broad message of this hearing, which is that we need to take a comprehensive and holistic approach. We need to improve access to education about infection prevention measures, like vaccines and hand washing. We need to make sure that we're using antimicrobials responsibly, whether it's in the hospital or in agriculture or in veterinary medicine. And we need to be investing in the development and manufacturing of new antibiotics in a market that isn't broken, in a market that is really fixed, that is working well. And so I want to dive into this from the perspective of shortages in antibiotics and what we've seen with this issue, and whether or not this question of supply chain is part of the broken part of the market. We saw shortages of antibiotics in this last year. We know that this is about, sometimes it is the antibiotic itself, or sometimes it's the component of the drug that we don't have. And it was with this in mind that caused me to team up with Senator Cassidy on our now law, the Onshoring Essential Antibiotics Act, which basically helps to expand, the concept is to expand domestic manufacturing capabilities by allowing HHS to award grants to antibiotics manufacturers to build or upgrade facilities here in the U.S. to basically onshore our supply chain. So let me start. Dr. Boucher, could you just talk a little bit about how you see this shortage affecting patients and your view of this?
Thank you, Senator Smith, for the question. We've seen antibiotic shortages for some years, and we see them almost routinely. Our hospital pharmacists send a thing out every week telling us about shortages, and we manage them often creatively, thinking about substitutions and ways to manage, but sometimes it's not easy, and sometimes it does affect patients. I'm in a very fortunate position to have expert pharmacists who work with me and supply chain experts in rural hospitals, in critical access hospitals. It's not so easy,
Exactly.
and the impact is greater. So addressing this is a huge need, and thank you for your attention. I will mention that especially injectable antibiotics require very special kinds of manufacturing often, which is difficult, and this is part of the reason we need a more robust pipeline, and we need to think about things like oral antibiotics. We haven't had a new oral antibiotic in over a decade.
Well, I think one of the things that we learned from the pandemic is the threats that we have when we do not have onshored manufacturing of so many things, including antibiotics. So maybe I'm wondering, Ms. Lawrence, if you'd like to comment from your own personal experience, whether you've seen issues with not being able to get access to an antibiotic that you really needed because it just wasn't available. Not about price, it's about availability.
Yes, thank you for the question, Senator Smith. I have been impacted by antibiotic shortages and other medical or medicinal shortages as well. And I am extremely fortunate to have an amazing care team at Boston Children's Hospital that knows how to work, pull, navigate. I also happen to have a best friend who's a pharmacy manager and can help with the pharmacy side. But I am very lucky to have that. And if I didn't have that, if I were elderly and didn't know how to navigate the system, or if I, didn't have the connections that I have, I would not know even where to begin to work around that shortage.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's really important. And you both are making the comment about how, antibiotic shortages affect different people differently based on who they are, where they live. I just have a few more minutes. Dr. Apley, I wanted to ask you about the concept of One Health and the idea that human health and animal health are inextricably linked, and that too often our federal agencies that oversee this sort of work in their silos rather than thinking about how we need to be thinking again holistically and comprehensively about bugs. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about this concept, what you see around the One Health framework. Senator Young and I worked on this together, and we have been working hard with the Department of Agriculture in particular to get this One Health framework adopted. Could you just talk a bit about where you see this going?
And again, going back to experiences on PACT-CARB, that was one of the fundamental underlying things is we are all into this together. If you look at the list of the American Veterinary Medical Association important resistant organisms in veterinary medicine, and you look at the CDC's list in human medicine, you'll see Pseudomonas, Staph aureus, non-typhoidal salmonella listed in both. So we share a lot of organisms that we have challenges with. And we also share a lot of the same needs for diagnostics, for helping get the best information to our practitioners, together understanding our human behavior and its interaction with how we dispense. And so many of the same messages, so much of the same information is vital to both physicians and veterinarians that it is absolutely wrapped up together.
Thank you. I know I'm out of time, Mr. Chair. I appreciate this hearing very much.
You can have extra time for wishing me a happy birthday. Thank you so much, Senator Smith. Let me ask you, Ms. Lawrence, your disease is one that actually has had enormous progress because of what the families have done. My friend, who I went to Malden Catholic High School with, Joe O'Donnell, his boy Joey contracted cystic fibrosis, and there was no cure. And companies really weren't doing the research on it. So he, along with the families, each year raised money and then said to biotech companies, if you do research in cystic fibrosis, we'll give you our money to do the research. And ultimately, the families raised hundreds of millions of dollars in order to incentivize research. And that's where a company named Vertex got their funding. It was from the families to give them that incentive. And these breakthroughs have all come because of that incredible entrepreneurial activity. My friend ultimately wound up, Joe O'Donnell, going to Harvard Business School. So we used that model to incentivize the private sector to move. And Joey, little Joey, would be your age today, but he passed away at a very, very young age. But now life expectancy has been lengthened dramatically. So we know that it can happen. We know that the breakthroughs are there. And we just have to find the methodologies that ensure that we're going to have research be medicine's field of dreams from which we harvest the findings that give hope to families, that they won't suffer unnecessarily from diseases in their families' lives. So how, Ms. Lawrence, can we better support patients in response to antimicrobial resistance?
Thank you for the question, Chairman Markey, and happy birthday as well. I actually met Joe last July at a conference, and he is wonderful, and he's done so much for the community, as has the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. I work with them on several levels, and I think that they are one thing that they really do well to drive community incentive in working together and funding different things is that they have a patient-centered model of care. So they hear the patient voice. They take into account the community needs and where the lack is, and that better directs the science. They have, like, patients like myself have input at a research level, at a grant level, at a need, like at a workshop level. Every level of the process, the patient voice is front and center. And that has really driven where the money goes and progress.
Beautiful, thank you. Dr. Boucher, in your written testimony, you talked about how climate change facilitates the risk of antimicrobial resistance. Can you talk more about that?
Thank you, Senator Markey, for the question. We know that climate change leads to more antimicrobial resistant infections through a number of ways. One is through wound infections and warmer temperatures, often are infected with antimicrobial resistant organisms. Waterborne organisms travel more, and we see more antimicrobial resistance there. And a lot of pathogens are picked up from the soil that has more resistant organisms in warm and hot climates. So we're already seeing the impacts, and we're doing studies in the Tufts Center looking at wastewater to see, and we're seeing changes already with just the small incremental changes in temperature we've seen. So certainly very linked, and linked in a One Health way, right, from humans, animals, and the environment as we see climate change evolve.
And as temperatures warm, animals now migrate to other parts of the planet that otherwise they would never have moved. And then that causes disease to migrate in ways that perhaps those populations are not as protected against.
Absolutely. We see migration of vectors of illness, things like animals, and we see evolution in places where infection isn't recognized because people haven't put two and two together that the area is moving. For example, moving south, like we've seen with Lyme disease, something very endemic in Massachusetts, which has now moved way south in our country. So lots of change, lots of room to act in the positive as well. And truly back to the wicked problem, one of the multi-pronged approaches needs to be really thinking about climate active impacts on AMR.
And again, wicked is such a Massachusetts Boston word as well, so it's bad. So Dr. Apley, you're an advocate of the One Health perspective. Could you explain the One Health approach and how our environment affects the people's health in the context of antimicrobial resistance?
I think we have been able to identify common approaches that by supporting them, we advance stewardship and our antibiotic decisions across every place we use them. One of the things that's happened in the PAC-CARB, again, was as we start to look at issues of fungi, we've brought in someone on that committee, that council, excuse me, that is an expert in agricultural applications of antimicrobials. And so we realized that this One Health really does involve the environment and any place we might be using the antimicrobials. And again, it involves diagnostics, preventives, new and novel ways of preventing disease and dampening it down. Once you break down the silo, just personally from 7.5 years on PAC-CARB, the things I learned from the human side that I take to veterinary medicine, and I think maybe that went the other way too, that having a group that's just really focused on breaking down those silos is incredibly important.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Miller, you're the chair of the Antimicrobials Working Group, the Pharmaceutical and Medical Device Industries Coalition on this issue. According to the Government Accountability Office, the existing development of new drugs that could treat bacteria currently resistant to medications is insufficient. Ms. Miller, how are companies partnering with the federal government to incentivize drug development with FDA pathways and exclusivity periods, and is that partnership working?
Thank you for the question, and happy birthday. So, there are really good and productive public-private partnerships to support AMR. It isn't enough in the end, right? Because we need to make sure that we're continually innovating because the bugs are continually evolving. So we need to ensure that we have an ongoing stream of innovation to have newer, safer antimicrobials over time. The existing relationships, they are working though, right? And we need to continue that. At the crux of it, though, we do need to address the commercial marketplace because I believe that if we do that, we will create an incentive for companies and for investors to come back into the space, to do more development, and to ensure that the relationships that we do have, the partnerships that we do have, these products can actually land in the marketplace effectively.
So again, let's talk about that. The families with cystic fibrosis, I think there were only 35,000 in America. They saw a market inefficiency. They saw where the private sector was not going to respond. So they injected themselves into it, raised the money, said to a number of companies, you do the research, we'll help to fund you. And ultimately, Vertex emerged out of those companies as the one that was doing the best work. So that was a market inefficiency. Just too few people are affected. So what do we have to do, Dr. Boucher, in order to deal with this issue that, such a small number of people potentially benefit from it, but by benefiting from it, they also stop the spread of it, potentially?
Senator Markey, happy birthday. I don't want to forget. And thanks for the question. So you hit on one of the key, really important criteria for antibiotics, right? The use in one patient affects a whole community. So that's the why we should care, even if this particular infection only impacts a few. And I'm going to come to something that we haven't talked about explicitly that I think is really important, and that's awareness. So it's a sad reality that in 2023, we still have an awareness problem for this AMR in our country. And holding this hearing is a good step in that, and that's what many of us at this table spend our time trying to do, but we have to do better, right? We still lack a clear voice and a clear patient voice. The National Action Plan has called for a federal champion for AMR. In the UK, you might have seen Dame Sally Davies. She's the champion of AMR. She's now a UN ambassador. She's done more for this in the world. She's leading, and I think we need that in our country. I hear you loud and clear. We are doing more clinical trials with patients at the table as we develop questions and trials through the NIH Antibacterial Resistance Leadership Group. We're making progress on looking at quality of life. Lots more to do and lots more rallying from the base in terms of patients and families.
So talk a little bit more about the champion. Who is that person and what are they doing?
So the champion that I have seen is Dame Sally is the spokesperson in Europe and globally now for this problem. So across the government, across the globe, actually speaking for the different stakeholders and bringing very practical things to the table with one voice and really being recognized. So we at PACCARB recognized this back in 2015, 2016, and it was incorporated into the National Action Plan. It just hasn't been implemented. But I think appointing such an individual would help advance this problem and our response to it.
You're saying that the administration should name a champion.
Yes,
so
the
that
ask is that the
person
president.
has a spotlight to continue to keep this issue front and center.
Yes, sir, that's the ask.
Okay, we'll try to help you to accomplish that goal. I think that's a great idea, and we need to have somebody who's in charge to be applying the pressure that all of the families in our country feel on this issue. So let's do this. And thank you all, by the way, so much for this incredible hearing today. I think you're really advancing the cause, and you can see the enormous interest which the subcommittee has in the subject. So let's do this. Let's give each one of you 1 minute to summarize what you want the subcommittee to retain from your testimony today. Just to get, and we'll go in reverse order of the original testimony so that you can give us your summary to the jury, to the subcommittee, in terms of what our agenda should be. What should we remember from today's hearing? So we'll begin with you, Ms. Miller.
Thank you. And maybe what I'll also start by saying is that while AMR is an issue where sometimes we only have antibiotics and antifungals to address a few patients, what we do know is that there are a number of patients that are affected by AMR every day. They're dying from infections. They may have cancer, and maybe their loved one thinks that they're dying from cancer, but they actually die from an infection. And so this is an everyday person's problem. It's not something that's in the future to be a problem for families and our loved ones. It's a today problem for folks. So what I would definitely like for everyone to walk away from today's discussion is to really understand that AMR is a threat to us, to our society, to our medical and healthcare system, that we need to have adequate development and ongoing innovation in the space to ensure that we will be able to save patients' lives. We also need to address the commercial marketplace. This is definitely something that really needs the federal government to step in and address. We need to see reforms in reimbursement. We need to see incentives like the PASTOR Act be put in place so that all of the development, all the public-private partnerships that are happening today actually have a place to land and that patients can get the life-saving medicines that they need.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Lawrence.
I hope that I have given a human depiction of what antibiotic resistance looks like so that it becomes more relatable to most. And I hope that I brought a sense of humanity to the issue, that it is not, many of us are not as impacted by something until it happens to us and until we're personally affected by it. And I hope that I can shed some light, or that the committee takes away, this is a global problem that will affect you at some point in time. So how proactive do you want to be? And I second the PASTOR Act before this Congress as well.
Thank you, and thank you for your powerful testimony here today. You were invaluable in putting the human face on this crisis. Dr. Boucher.
Thank you, Senator Markey. I echo the gratitude for being here and emphasizing that this problem is here and now, affects all of us, and we need to act immediately. We need to ensure that we have a workforce to prepare for and address this problem, and we need to advance the PASTEUR Act, the bipartisan act supported by the IDSA and over 200 organizations that will provide a subscription model for the most needed antibiotics and is linked to good stewardship and the prudent use of those antibiotics. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Apley.
Thank you, Chairman Markey. Two things. I want to be very clear that new antibiotics are very, very important, but as a clinical pharmacologist, I also see a need for advancing our understanding of the regimens we use for existing antimicrobials. I think that could be a very big thing we could support. And number two, one of the words we really haven't used here today is risk. And when a physician or a veterinarian takes a stand on antimicrobial stewardship and saying, I know you want one, but we're not going to, there's a risk that's undertaken. And supporting physicians and veterinarians in undertaking that risk with information and collaboration is incredibly important.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Apley, very much. And we thank everyone who has participated today, especially our witnesses who have traveled here today from Massachusetts, Kansas, and New York. Each witness here told us loud and clear, if we do not address antimicrobial resistance, we will face a growing healthcare threat to our country. And today, we are not only illustrating the problem, but illuminating the path forward. We need a healthcare system that puts people first, providers to have all the tools readily available to treat patients with the best medications available. We need to find a way in which we incentivize the development of new solutions to this problem, and we need a healthy planet that doesn't facilitate the spread of these deadly diseases. So ordinarily, at this point, I would ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks and the remarks of the committee members here, but in this instance, I'm going to ask to revise and delete any references to my birthday from the record, without objection, and I ask unanimous consent to have a statement from stakeholders outlining priorities for addressing antimicrobial resistance, and for any senators who wish to ask additional questions, for the record, it will be open for 10 business days until July 25th at 5 p.m., and all senators are invited to ask those questions in writing and for the witnesses then to answer them in writing as well. And with that, this very important hearing is adjourned. Thank you.